Oops! Yeah, you probably get the point. But today, we all know that Germany and Austria are separate countries. But we must also know that Germany and Austria have a lot in common. Most Austrians are ethnic Germans. Both speak the German language, share many traditions, and are generally culturally similar. But this begs the question, why are Germany and Austria separate countries? And most importantly, why does Austria exist? Before we dive into the why, we will briefly explain Germany and Austria. We all know that Germany is a massive powerhouse, speaks German, is generally prosperous, and is just a notable country in Europe. One thing to note about Germany is that it is a federal republic, and there are individual states within Germany itself that have their more distinct culture and even dialects. Some of them are Bavaria, Saxony, Baden-Württemberg, and more. Austria is a republic just southeast of Germany. They have their own Austrian-German dialect, much closer to Bavarian. The name Austria, not to be confused with Australia, comes from the Old High German word Ostariki, meaning Eastern Realm. Like Germany, Austria is generally prosperous with more mountains. It all lies down in their history and nationalism. But before we discuss nationalism, we will go back to the Middle Ages. So multiple peoples have settled in today's Austria, such as Romans, Goths, Slavs, Avars, etc. But eventually, the Austrian lands became part of the Frankish Empire. It collapsed and divided into West Francia, which became the Kingdom of France, Middle Francia, which acted like a sandwich between the West and East Francia, and East Francia, which would eventually become the German Kingdom, and later the Holy Roman Empire. So East Francia also included the Austrian lands, but it became a sort of buffer, also known as March, a frontier region between any threats from the east. And threats came, most of them were Hungarians and Slavs. Being a generally mountainous area, Austria would serve as a reliable eastern frontier that would fend off these threats, especially the Hungarian ones. It was also when the name Austria was coined, appearing in the year 996 in a document of King Otto III written as Ostariki. It referred to the territory of the Babenberg March. The Babenbergs, a noble dynasty of Austrian margraves and dukes, would rule Margraviate of Austria and later the Duchy of Austria. When Austria was a margraviate, it was part of the Duchy of Bavaria within the Holy Roman Empire. Bavarian influence would eventually Germanize the Austrian lands. Eventually, by the 13th century, the Babenberg dynasty became extinct because its king, Frederick II of Babenberg, was killed in a battle against Hungarians with no heir. Austrian lands became contested between rival factions. During this period, a certain Rudolf I from the House of Habsburg prevailed against his rival, Ottokar II of Bohemia. It started the rise of the Habsburgs, which would rule Austria for many centuries. Fun fact, the term Habsburg was derived from the Habsburg Castle, located in Switzerland. Through conquest and marriages, the Habsburg monarchy would eventually become one of the most powerful entities in Europe, stretching its influence from Spain, Belgium, and Italy to the borders of Poland and the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. They would also have a throne of the Holy Roman Emperor. Although the Habsburg monarchy became associated with Austria, Austria itself was still confined to the Archduchy of Austria and its immediate vicinity. The Habsburg monarchy would eventually fight the destructive wars against the Ottomans, including the Battle of Vienna in 1683, in which the Polish winged hussars came to save Europe, and several European wars like the 30 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession. The Habsburg monarchy, suffering some setbacks, continued to expand within its vicinity, incorporating the Czech lands, Hungary, and even parts of Poland. Austria continued to become the most influential German entity, but another German entity sought to challenge it, and that entity was Prussia. Prussia was previously a Polish vassal, eventually becoming the Kingdom of Prussia. Prussia and Austria would eventually clash during the War of the Austrian Succession, grabbing Silesia for itself. Subsequently, these two would face each throat again in the 7 Years' War, but the Russian switch saved Prussia from total annihilation. The French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleoning of Europe ended the Holy Roman Empire and brought Europe against the revolutionary wrath of Napoleon. During the War of the Fourth and the Fifth Coalitions, Austria and Prussia were severely crippled with territorial losses. Still, the Russian bears' chasing of Napoleon gave these two states a reason to become a great power again. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 created the German Confederation, expanded the Kingdom of Prussia and the now Austrian Empire, and set up a balance of power in Europe. The German Confederation was, well, a confederation of German states that included most of Prussia and parts of the Austrian Empire. But going back, the French Revolution also created the ideas of nationalism and self-determination, which was problematic for Austria. Unlike Prussia, which is primarily German, the Austrian Empire was a diverse empire with Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Croatians, Slovenians, Czechs, Ukrainians, Slovaks, Serbs, Romanians, and Italians inhabiting. Most of these ethnic minorities have their desires for self-determination, but the most notable one is the German one. German nationalism aims for a single unified German state. It culminated in the 1848 German Revolution, when German liberals and nationalists sought to establish just that, with a liberal constitution under the Frankfurt Convention, but it wasn't successful. The Hungarians also attempted to secede, and it was only thwarted by Russian intervention on behalf of Austria. Even though the 1848 revolution wasn't very successful, the idea of a unified German state persisted. There were two proposals: Klein Deutschland, known as Lesser Germany, a unified Germany without Austria, and Grossdeutschland, known as Greater Germany, a unified Germany with Austria. The Habsburgs preferred to dominate Germany with themselves in power, but the Prussians preferred Klein Deutschland and preferred to kick Austria out of German affairs. At this point, the German Confederation was dominated by Austria and its allies, and Prussia sought to change that. And change they did. Sparked by some dispute near Denmark, Prussia and Austria went to war, and Prussia performed well. However, the Minister-President of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, did not push deeper into Austria. Although he did attain Prussian objectives, establishing the North German Confederation and kicking Austria out of German affairs. It would be the first significant factor in why Austria was separated from Germany, as the most influential German state outside Austria excluded them from a future unified Germany. Incidentally, the Italians would realize their own Italian unification by siding with Prussia and grabbing Venice for its own. Meanwhile, separatism within Austria itself was a significant threat, and the Austrians desperately talked with the Hungarians for a compromise to save the empire. The dual monarchy was established, also known as Austria-Hungary. Prussia would eventually realize a united Germany without Austria by winning the captured ruler contest against France, declaring the German Empire and incorporating the remaining German states. The new German Empire grew more powerful, while Austria-Hungary, a dual power in Central Europe, still faced the threat of separatism from its minorities. However, Germany and Austria-Hungary reconciled and became allied in the face of the upcoming European War. And a forthcoming European War, it came. World War I sparked from some damn things in the Balkans within a diplomatically tense environment. Germany and Austria-Hungary were allied, but the latter became increasingly dependent on Germany. But they lost, and these two empires collapsed. Germany lost a chunk of its territory, and several treaties partitioned the dissolved Austria-Hungary. The German people were left humiliated. In Austria, the Republic of German Austria was formed as a short-lived entity claiming German lands in the former Austria-Hungary. During this period, the idea of a union between Austria and Germany prevailed among the Austrians again, and the provisional constitution stated that it would eventually join the new Weimar Republic. However, the Allies vetoed this because they feared a united German-speaking state. They insisted that Austria remain an independent state and dropped their South Tyrol and German Bohemia claims. Many Austrians and Germans saw this as hypocrisy since US President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed the idea of self-determination, and the Germans were given none of it. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, many Austrians and Germans continued to support the Austro-German unification, and the rise of a particular Austrian painter in Germany pushed that move even further. But by the 1930s, skepticism grew among some Austrians, including Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, a right-wing politician who was moving Austria towards dictatorship. Dollfuss himself was assassinated by some Austrians who adhered to the Austrian painter's ideology. Even Benito Mussolini said he would support Austria against any German aggression. Kurt Schuschnigg, the next chancellor, was even more skeptical of unifying Austria with that Germany, and he tried desperately to keep Austria independent. However, by 1938, he was forced to resign. German forces entered the country and proclaimed the Anschluss of Austria. Italy also did nothing to stop the Anschluss. While many Austrians still wanted unification with Germany, the ideology of the German regime at that time raised eyebrows among many Austrians, especially left-wing ones. Whether the Austrians wanted it, the Germans forced it on them, or it was an act of aggression, it is debatable. But the other countries, except Mexico, which somehow complained against it, accepted it because they thought they couldn't do much without declaring war, which they didn't want and they weren't ready of at the time. Now, Austria is part of Germany. Okay, but of course, it wouldn't last long, and by 1945, the German regime had been thoroughly put into a state of non-existence. Now what? Well, Austria became an independent state again, but the Allies occupied Austria along with Germany and split it up between occupation zones. The Allies also regarded Austria as a victim of aggression by the German Reich, which is controversial since many Austrians supported the regime until its collapse. Unlike Germany, which was split up between West and East Germany, Austria remained united thanks to diplomacy, politics, and several conditions. These conditions include guaranteeing Austrian neutrality, and the most important of all, prohibiting Austria from uniting with Germany ever again. By 1955, they agreed to Austrian independence. Afterward, Austria would become an independent state, cultivating its own national identity and distancing itself from Germany. They don't want to unite anymore, even if West and East Germany reunified after the Cold War. A survey carried out in 2008 found that 82% of Austrians consider themselves to be their own nation. Today, Austria is a member of the European Union and Schengen, and Germans and Austrians can come to their respective countries. They are considered brothers and related countries, but I don't think unification will happen in the foreseeable future. The Austrian State Treaty still forbids any unification from happening. To summarize, Germany and Austria are separate countries due to historical reasons. Even though Germany and Austria share many cultural and linguistic links, Austria's exclusion from the German Empire was one factor. The Allies then forbade Austria from uniting with the Weimar Republic when they tried to do so. But when Austro-German unification happened, they had unified with one of the most brutal regimes globally, and that regime would eventually be defeated in a destructive war. And when Austria regained its independence, they made it pretty clear that they would not unify with Germany again, abandon pan-Germanism, and cultivate their own national identity instead. That is why Germany and Austria are separate countries, and they will continue to be separated for the foreseeable future. By the way, maybe you want to visit Germany. If yes, you have a variety of cities and places of interest to choose from. Just don't shout anything that clicks on the ideology of the Austrian painter. Or maybe you want to come to Austria. Like Germany, you also have a variety of cities and places of interest to choose from. I recommend the village of Fugging in Lower Austria. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for more country neighbors.